That was the last thing you heard. The question was about the loss. Hold that sentence. It is the key to everything that follows. Here is a bet. A coin will be tossed. If it lands on tails, you lose $100. If it lands on heads, you win $150. The expected value is positive. You stand to gain more than you stand to lose. A perfectly rational agent would take this bet every time. Would you take it? Most people say no. Not because the math is wrong, because the feeling is. The prospect of losing $100 produces a sensation that $150 of winning cannot overcome. The pain of losing is not the opposite of the pleasure of gaining. It is larger. It is older. She was asked, "Would you bet your career on this?" She said yes. She would not have said yes to a different version of the same question. Would you risk a patient's life? Same data, same odds, different frame, different answer. Loss aversion. The question she answered was not the question she was asked. It started with a book, a slim volume with a dark red cover. An essay by the economist Bruno Frey. Amos Tversky slid it across the desk to Daniel Kahneman and waited. The opening line described the agent of economic theory. Rational, selfish, and his tastes do not change. Kahneman read it. Ah! And something caught. Not the rationality. They had already spent years dismantling that. Not the selfishness. The stability. The assumption that the value of something depends on how much of it you have. That a person with $5 million has a fixed amount of happiness, regardless of whether they had 1 million yesterday or 9. That assumption had a name. It had been the foundation of economic theory for 250 years. And it was wrong. Jack and Jill both have $5 million today. By every measure in classical economics, they should be equally happy. Utility is a function of wealth. Same wealth, same utility. But yesterday, Jack had 1 million. He has just received $4 million. He is elated. Yesterday, Jill had 9 million. She has just lost $4 million. She is devastated. Same wealth, different happiness. The theory says this should not happen. Utility depends on the final state. The path you took to get there is irrelevant. But Kahneman knew instantly, as anyone would, that the path is the only thing that matters. Jack is rich. Jill is ruined. The number 5 million means nothing without knowing where they started. In 1738, Daniel Bernoulli proposed that the utility of wealth is not linear. $1,000 means more to a beggar than to a billionaire. The relationship is logarithmic. Each additional unit of wealth produces less additional happiness. This was elegant. This was useful. This was the foundation upon which all of expected utility theory was built. And it contained a flaw that survived 250 years. Bernoulli defined utility as a function of the final state of wealth, not the change, not the movement, the destination. Jack and Jill, in Bernoulli's framework, are the same person. Kahneman later called this theory-induced blindness. The theory was so useful, so deeply embedded in the mathematics of economics, that the flaw became invisible, not because it was hidden, because no one had reason to look. Anthony has $1 million. Betty has 4 million. Both are offered the same gamble, a 50-50 chance to end up with either 1 million or 4 million. Or they can skip the gamble and take 2 million, guaranteed. Anthony looks at the gamble. He could gain 3 million or gain nothing. But the sure thing gives him 1 million, a guaranteed gain. He takes the sure thing. He is risk-averse. Betty looks at the same gamble. She could lose 3 million more, down to 1, or stay where she is. The sure thing gives her 2 million, a guaranteed loss of 2 million from where she stands. She takes the gamble. She is risk-seeking. Same gamble. Same final states. Same probabilities. Opposite decisions. Bernoulli's theory cannot explain this. Expected utility says they should choose the same thing because the outcomes are the same. But Anthony is playing from a position of gain, and Betty is playing from a position of loss. Their reference points are different, and the reference point determines everything. They walked. For 5 years, they walked. Through the quiet streets of Jerusalem, through afternoons that stretched into evenings, they built a theory by conversation. Not in a lab, not at a blackboard, in motion, side by side, finishing each other's objections before they were raised. The theory they built would become the most cited paper in the history of the social sciences. It was published in Econometrica in 1979. They called it prospect theory, and it began with 3 observations about how the mind actually experiences value. 1. Evaluation is relative to a reference point. 2. Sensitivity diminishes as magnitude increases. 3. Losses loom larger than gains. This is the shape of how you feel. The right side is gains. The curve rises, but it flattens. The difference between $100 and $200 feels larger than the difference between $900 and $1,000. This is diminishing sensitivity. The same principle Bernoulli noticed, applied not to total wealth but to changes from where you stand. The left side is losses. The curve drops, and it drops faster, steeper. The pain of losing $100 is not equal to the pleasure of gaining $100. It is roughly twice as strong. The loss aversion ratio, measured across dozens of studies, falls between 1.5 to 1 on average. You need to gain about $200 to compensate for the pain of losing $100. This is not a preference. It is not a decision. It is a feature of the nervous system, built into the architecture of evaluation. The amygdala responds to a threatening face in less than 0.02 of a second before the conscious mind has registered what it is looking at. Bad events are processed faster, remembered longer, and weighted more heavily than good ones. A single cockroach will ruin a bowl of cherries. A single cherry will do nothing for a bowl of cockroaches. The psychologist John Gottman studied marriages. He found that for a relationship to survive, the ratio of good interactions to bad must be at least 5 to 1. Not because people are ungrateful, because each negative interaction carries the emotional weight of 5 positive ones. The architecture of loss aversion is the architecture of love. Professional golfers putt more accurately when they are putting for par, avoiding a bogey, which is a loss, than when they are putting for birdie, which is a gain. The difference is measurable. For Tiger Woods alone, it was worth approximately $1 million per season. He was not more skilled on par putts. He was more motivated. The loss was watching. After a blizzard, 82% of people surveyed said it was unfair for a hardware store to raise the price of snow shovels. The store had something people needed. The price was the reference point. Changing it felt like a loss, even though no one was forced to buy. This is loss aversion applied to the market itself. The status quo is the reference point, and any departure from it in the wrong direction registers as harm. The experiment was run dozens of times. Half the students received a coffee mug. The other half received nothing. Then they were asked to trade. The sellers, the students who had the mug, were asked the minimum price at which they would sell. The buyers were asked the maximum price they would pay. The sellers wanted $7.12. The buyers would pay $2.87. A gap of more than 2 to 1. For a mug they had owned for less than 10 minutes. There was a third group. Choosers. They were shown the mug and asked, "Would you prefer to have this mug or this amount of cash?" No ownership, no loss, just a choice. Their valuation was $3.12, nearly identical to the buyers. The sellers and the choosers faced the same decision, mug or money. But the sellers owned the mug. Giving it up was a loss, and the loss doubled the price. This is the endowment effect. Owning something changes its value, not in the market, but in the mind. The mug on your desk is worth more than the identical mug in the store, because the mug on your desk can be taken from you, and the prospect of losing activates a system that the prospect of gaining does not. A professor of economics, a man who taught rational choice theory, would not sell a bottle of wine from his collection for $100, even though he would never pay more than $35 for the same bottle at auction. He was not irrational. He was human. The wine was his. The pain of giving it up exceeded the pleasure of the money that would replace it. Loss aversion is not a theory about irrational people. It is a theory about people. Richard Thaler, the economist who first named the endowment effect, had been collecting examples of irrationality for years. He called them anomalies. He had no theory to explain them. Then he read a draft of prospect theory, Kahneman-Tversky's paper, before it was published, and the anomalies organized themselves. Loss aversion explained the endowment effect. The endowment effect explained the wine. The wine explained the professor. Professor was everyone. But there is a caveat. Experienced traders show no endowment effect. In experiments, 48% of experienced traders traded their mugs away, compared to 18% of novices. Goods held for exchange, inventory, stock, currency, do not trigger loss aversion the way goods held for use do. The mug on your desk is different from the mug in the warehouse. The difference is not the mug. The difference is whether your mind has classified it as yours. Prospect theory predicts a pattern, not a single bias. A fourfold pattern that governs how you respond to risk depending on two variables: whether you face a gain or a loss, and whether the probability is high or low. When the probability of a gain is high, you become cautious. You have something almost certain, and you do not want to lose it. You accept less than the expected value to lock in the win. This is the certainty effect. The jump from 95% to 100% feels enormous, far larger than the jump from 50 to 55. When the probability of a gain is low, you become reckless. The tiny chance of a large win captures the imagination. You overweight it? You buy the lottery ticket. You reject a sure $500 for a 5% chance at 10,000. The possibility effect, the jump from 0 to 5%, feels like the jump from impossible to real. When the probability of a loss is high, you gamble. The loss is almost certain, and you cannot accept it. You take desperate risks to avoid it, even when the gamble makes the expected outcome worse. This is why defendants reject plea bargains. This is why failing companies double down. This is why losing generals attack. When the probability of a loss is low, you become cautious again, but in the wrong direction. You overweighed the small chance of disaster. You buy insurance you do not need. You pay 3 times more to eliminate a risk entirely than to reduce it by 2/3, even when the reduction saves more expected value. Parents in one study were willing to pay far more to reduce the risk of a pesticide from 5 in 10 million to 0 than to reduce it from 15 in 10 million to 5. The objective improvement was identical. The psychological improvement was not. 0 is not a number. 0 is a feeling. For cells, for patterns. Each one a departure from rational expected value. Each one produced by the same machinery. The reference point, diminishing sensitivity, and loss aversion, interacting with the way the mind transforms probabilities into decision weights. Decision weights are not probabilities. They are what probabilities feel like. And what they feel like is systematically distorted. They published the paper in Econometrica in 1979, Prospect Theory. It would become the most cited paper in the social sciences, not because it was the most complex, because it asked the simplest question no one had thought to ask. Not, how much do you have? But, compared to what? Bernoulli's theory had endured for 250 years because it was useful. It generated predictions. It built models. It trained generations of economists. And it contained a flaw, visible to anyone who paused to think about Jack and Jill. The flaw survived not because it was hidden, but because the theory was so productive that no one had incentive to look. Kahneman called this theory-induced blindness. The theory becomes the lens, and the lens cannot see itself. What Kahneman and Tversky built in those 5 years on those quiet streets was not a correction to expected utility theory. It was a replacement of its deepest assumption. The mind does not evaluate final states. It evaluates changes, not where you are, but where you are relative to where you expected to be. The reference point is not in the world. It is in the mind, and it can be moved. Return to the coin. The bet was good. The expected value was positive. You knew this. Then most of you said no. Not because you miscalculated. Because the loss of $100 was more vivid, more urgent, more real than the gain of $150. System 2 can do the math. But the critical input, the feeling that drives the decision, comes from System 1. And System 1 does not do math. It does pain. The mathematician Matthew Rabin proved something remarkable. If a person rejects this small, favorable gamble consistently across modest stakes, then their implied risk aversion at larger stakes becomes absurd. They would reject a 50-50 chance to lose $200 or gain $20,000. They would reject a 50-50 chance to lose $300 or gain the entire wealth of the world. The rejection of the small bet, taken seriously, implies a level of risk aversion that no rational agent would hold. The preference is not rational. It is visceral. It is loss aversion, operating at the scale of a $100 bill. Return to the hospital. 70% success and 90% survival are not the same frame. One emphasizes what is gained, the other whispers what is lost. She heard the version about betting her career, a gain frame, and she said yes. She did not hear the version about risking a life, a loss frame, because no one asked it that way. The reference point was chosen for her. The question was asked in a frame, and the frame determined the answer before she began to think. The loss was always larger than the gain. She felt it before she understood it. The reference point was never neutral. It was chosen. And if the reference point can be chosen, if the starting position can be moved, then the frame is not a window. It is a weapon. The frame changed. And the frame is the most powerful tool the machine has.